After d4, d5, c4, knight c6. In this video we're going to go through knight c3. Okay, as we know, we play knight f6 now. And we're going to look at the setup with the 4 knights. And as we know, we play bishop g4. If you haven't seen this, there's plenty of videos I've done in the past about the Chigorin saga. Make sure you check them out and you learn before you watch this video. So as mentioned, we play bishop g4. Now, here there could be a transposition. If instead of knight f3, white first takes this pawn, you take back, right? In one of the previous videos, we went through extensively the main line, which is e4 now. As we know, we have to take the knight, pawn takes back, and then e5. Make sure you watch that video. If white plays knight f3 now, you can play bishop to g4, and this is a transposition of what we're about to see. So let's restart. And after knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, we play the bishop. And now if white takes in d5, then you take back, and this is the exact position reached just a couple of seconds ago. So let's look at this. The pawn just took in d5 and the knight takes back. Okay. In this situation, when they play e4, here, believe it or not, we're just going to do all the swaps now, and this is fine for black. This is what we will do. The most accurate way to continue is the following. Bishop takes. Obviously, queen takes is really bad because you're allowing knight to go to d4 and win a pawn, a central pawn. So you have to take with the pawn. Then knight takes knight, pawn takes back, and now e5. So it looks like our opponent's got both the bishop pair and an unbelievable center. Look at this center. However, the thing is that the queens are still on the board and the white king cannot castle anywhere safe. So make sure you don't trade queens in this game. Do your best not to do it. After this move, now we have triple attack with the square d4. So our opponent will have to do something about it. Pay attention to the fact that bishop e3 developing to protect that pawn doesn't work because he will take the pawn, and when the pawn takes back, check. The bishop cannot block because then you can just take in d4. You're protecting this bishop. We win a central pawn for no reason. Position already evaluated as if black was almost up a piece. So in this position, after the check, what if the king moves? Well, okay, queen to f6. And we're ready to just move, castle, get the rook on this file, and finalize the pressure over the square d4. This pawn can never really push because you have this tremendous check. And after that, you're forking the king and rook, and if the queen, well, the queen can't block, but if the bishop blocks, you can just trade everything. You're attacking this rook. And so that move cannot happen. What if white plays e5, attacking the queen? This seems to be making sense. Simply queen e6, and you're okay. a3 attacking the bishop, bishop a5, retreated, and you don't have to worry about the bishop being kicked out from there, simply because there's no pawn on the b file. And now, if the rook develops, let's say rook b1 for example, like queen a2 wins immediately. Because this is a very powerful queen and this is a very powerful bishop. And whenever the swaps are initiated, this rook will be left without anyone defending it. So that move is not possible. Now you might argue that the move pawn to d5 appears to be possible. It's a fork, it's attacking these two pieces, it's defended by a queen. But again, you will just take in e5, and when the knight gets taken, then queen b2 becomes accessible, and the king, you will just win the rook. If instead, even crazier, if the king goes here, then there's no reason to continue this game because the rook will be pinning the opponent, skewering the king and go for an attack on the queen, so there's no point. So let's make a recap and try to master the Chigorin defense more and more with these videos. Knight c3, knight f6, and we got the 4-knight setup with the bishop obviously going to g4. Pawn takes, you take with the knight, and after e4, take, e5. So we're looking at when the bishop defends. So now we take this pawn, right? Obviously taking back with the pawn is bad because of bishop b4. It's a very strong move. The best move would be to take back with the bishop. And now there's an all trade situation, but at least, remember, you're playing black and you have completely nullified the development of the white player. You take this one, and obviously taking back the pawn allows you to make this strong check. The king is forced to move, and this is really bad. You got an advantage here because of the misplaced king. Now it doesn't mean you're completely winning, not at all, but you see, after this check and a king moves there, this king is kind of safe in a way. It's safe in a way that is not gonna be checkmated, but it allows us too much. It allows our very strong bishop to be placed in that square. The rook is developed. And soon enough, we'll be trading the central pawns because you're going to be playing the c pawn, the f pawn, and if our opponent refuses the swaps, we've got rooks coming on open files. So this is a much better position for black. So in this position, the best move according to the engine is h5. We're not going to be... See, the thing is, we're not able... Because of the queen is well placed, and you don't really have that much of a reason now to take this queen, because, see, this is the mistake you will play. If you take this queen, the pawn takes back. Yes, it is true that you make this check with the bishop, but you don't have enough pieces to actually start an attack. It's just the bishop. It's not going to do anything. The king moves, but the king is safe. And as soon as white plays bishop to h3, develop, the two rooks are connected and open files. The white king in e2 is absolutely safe. So here you have created a weakness. The weakness is this isolated pawn in c3, and you want to keep it like that. You'd rather be taken by the queen so you can develop, but not the other way around. So the best move is h5. You might want to get the rook this way, which seems a bit crazy, but it's kind of what you're forced to do. Now here it's white to move. Let's make an example. What if white castles like this? And in this case, the development is complete. Here, the best move is actually to take the queen. Now, this sounds crazy because we just talked about not aligning the pawns of our opponent, but here there's a reason for it, right? Because here, if white castles, then take, the pawns are now realigned, but now rook h6, and now we're threatening to start putting pressure on the weaknesses of our opponent. See, for example, now this bishop check doesn't do anything. You're gonna be pushing the pawns. The bishop has to move again. If white plays d5, with the idea of playing bishop b5, this looks like a better check. You play rook to f6, and you're attacking the weak pawn. This cannot be pushed. You will take it. Bishop to e2 defends that pawn. Now bishop to d6. And the idea is one and simple. The idea is to play king f8, and then bishop to f4 check, and solidify the pawn structure with g6. Why is it that black is winning this game? What's the reason? You wouldn't say that. It's 6 pawns against 6 pawns, 2 rooks and a bishop against 2 rooks and a bishop. Why is it that black is winning? That's the important thing to understand in chess, is that sometimes the engine can already tell you that a position is completely lost, where to a human it looks like it's completely equal. The thing is this, and think about it. If you focus, you will see that there's 2 pawns connected against a lonely pawn. So these 2 pawns are marching to victory, and our opponent cannot make a progress because this bishop is very well placed. It cannot be removed by any pawn anytime. And the funny thing is that these pawns are going to be useless because they can't make any progress. And whereas these pawns are going to be technically unstoppable, they're going to be supported. So that's why the black's position is dominating here. White cannot make any single attack. A move like rook g1, you just play g6. These 3 pawns defend each other forever. This pawn isn't going anywhere because it's not connected to anyone. This h pawn will just go to h5 and be blocked by h4. It's completely blocked. So if we take it from the start, we'll be able to understand more. Knight c3, knight f6, the 4 knights. And we look at the variation where the pawn takes immediately, and now e4. Okay, swap everything. Take. e5. The bishop protecting. Okay, take. Bishop blocks. Okay, takes. Queen takes, and now h5. This is the weakness that has been created, and this isolated pawn. Okay, what if in this position white plays rook to b1? This is a strong move because it attacks this weak pawn, and you can't really push this pawn. Obviously, this will be a disaster. After bishop b5, you can resign. So, and you don't really want to play queen to c8 or rook to b8 because that allows the queen to go to a7. You don't want to go into any of that. So now here you have to trade. Pawn takes back, and now you can solve every problem with long castle. Now here you're putting pressure on this pawn, so rook to d1 is silly because you can make a check, whereas d5 looks like no, this pawn chain has been built, but it's the same situation as before. We're winning, we're better. Now black goes on with rook h6. You're gonna place the rook in f6. The bishop is gonna help you out, and these 2 pawns will slowly but relentlessly reach the end. So going back to this position, here black has to play e5, as we remember. Let's not look at bishop blocks. Bishop helps the pawn with e3. Let's look at this move, d5. Our opponent continues on this pawn chain, but it doesn't give up the pawn in c3. Therefore, the pawn chain is stronger, and now we don't have a majority of these 2 pawns because white is also protecting all the files on the queen side. So this looks better. However, you play knight a5. Now here there's not much to do. Queen to a4 check. You just block with c6. And this is the best move that you can possibly play. Remember, when your opponent has this pawn chain and you're playing the Chigorin, always play c6. If they take you, they lose the advantage. I mean, not that white has an advantage, but they lose the initiative, and you're just gonna take back with the knight. So take. I mean, it's not like it cannot be avoided. Also because here you're planning to play a6 and then b5, kicking the queen away. That's what you want to do. And then when the queen is no longer pinning the diagonal, you will take this pawn, and black is better. So let's make an example. If white takes the pawn, then knight takes back. And after bishop to b5, applying more pressure over that knight. Now obviously you don't want to play rook c8 because the queen can take in a7, the knight is pinned, right? So you want to play queen b6, defending everything. And now here, yes, it is true that our opponent can create a weakness in our territory by taking everything. Let's look at it in a second. What if white plays bishop e3 attacking the queen? Nothing, you just develop, play bishop c5. And here white reduces the initiative even more because now we're threatening to take, and then go there with check. It's an amazing position. So after take, that's it. Our opponent is left with nothing better to do, also because we're attacking his pawn, left with nothing better to do than just swap everything here and try to create a weakness for us as well. So in this position, after queen to b6, instead of bishop e3, which reduces the initiative, what if white just does what it's supposed to? Say take, and now we have an isolated pawn as well. Okay, this is the best that white can do when position is almost equal. Let's say slightly better for black, but still. Rook g1, you just play g6. You don't have to worry about anything. That rook is useless there. The rook will have to go somewhere else, to another file. And the game continues from here. This is the best that black can. This is the best that white can do. But remember, white is playing. I mean, white is white, and yet the game is completely dirty. The queen's gambit has been completely nullified. Here in this position, earlier we went through queen a4. We mentioned what the plan was. If queen a4, we played c6. What if white plays c4? This is the strongest move available for our opponent. Now black continues with b6. Remember, c4, here's what the principle you need to remember. c4 blocks the bishop from the possibility for the bishop to go to b5. Meaning that now we can just play b6. We don't have to worry about pawn takes. Let's see, for example, if it was our move again here, you will just play bishop c5 and castle the king. And you have a great initiative. So it looks like the pawn can take this pawn for free, but this pawn is isolated, remains weak, and now this pawn is also threatening check, and it looks kind of scary, but queen to c7 will simply recapture the pawn, and it is impossible for white to defend this pawn more. And as soon as you're done taking it, remember c5 can't push now, you will just do this. Yeah, the bishop might go to b5, that is pointless. You castle and there's nothing, there's not a single threat. Yeah, the opponent will have a passed pawn, but after you play a6, the bishop will have to move again, so it's a complete waste of time. It doesn't make any sense. And that's it. Again, the queen's gambit has been completely nullified. What if white plays bishop a3? This looks interesting. If you take, it takes back, and now you can't castle anymore. You're going to have to castle this side, but you just take this pawn, right? And now you're attacking the queen. The queen can't really stick around to defend the bishop. That means the queen's forced to take. Knight takes, bishop takes. We can't castle anymore. I mean, you're going to have to take the rook here, and you're threatening to castle long, and our opponent might try to do something else. Rook g1 is always useless with the queen's gambit when you play the Chigorin, because g6 just nullifies it. So our opponent might do maybe bishop h3 and then castle this side and then play the rooks here. Rook d1 stops us from castling, but you just play king e7. The rooks are connected, and black is in a very comfortable endgame. So in this position, we went through queen a4. What about bishop b5? How about this? Looks better. So because our opponent will not have to trade everything, at least the queens will stay on the board. c6 comes. And now after take, we can first swap queens and then take, and our opponent, we will both have an isolated pawn, but there's no advantage anymore. Again, the queen's gambit has been neutralized. Bishop a4, keeping the pawn, is met with bishop to c5, within one step away from castling. Rook to b1, attacking, putting pressure on the weak pawn. You play queen to h4. That's just an example. Now bishop e3 is not possible now because you can take it for free. The pawn in f2 is pinned. So our opponent will have to play queen e2. And now you just castle. You're out of every danger. c4 by white, solidifying the pawn structure. You can just take it, right? For free. So, because you got this strong attack on f2, so c4 is not possible. White can't really castle anywhere. White will be forced to play something like bishop to e3. Black is much better after taking it. The queen has to take. And again, remember that this pawn chain here might look strong, but it's not. Here, now you will simply win the pawn in d5, for example. Pawn can't take back. You got an attack on this bishop, and everything is falling apart. So let's take this from the start. So we're looking at the 4 knights variation. The bishop is going there. So take, e4. Okay, take, e5. What if white plays the absolute best move, rook to b1? Here we ignore the attack on the pawn in b7 because you played bishop to d6. And now if the rook takes the pawn in b7, yes, looks like a free pawn. It also prepares bishop to b5. Maybe it looks really annoying. You will just castle though. And the bishop in b5 wouldn't be pinning anything. So at least the knight is not going to be in trouble. So now white goes on with development. Bishop to e3 makes sense. You don't really want to take here. It's stupid to leave this pawn under attack. The bishop doesn't really want to go to d3 because you got this double attack on the pawn, and then d3 is kind of covering the pawn. So that will actually lose material, and the position is much better for black at that point. So here in this position, after bishop to e3, now the best move is actually to take. Pawn takes back, but now we do have the usual bishop b4 check, right? This is just good. And now here it looks like the bishop can block in d2, because after queen to d4 here, we wouldn't really be able to take this in b4 because the rook is defending. However, you missed the part where you can just take the bishop, queen takes back, and now you have double attack on d4. Position evaluated as if black was literally almost up a piece, Knight takes in d4, threatening this, threatening a lot of bad things. The queen can go to f6 as well. The rook can move. Depending on what our opponent will do, the queen will have to be extremely careful to how she moves. Queen f6 will be putting more pressure. The rooks are coming on the file of the queen. It's already game over. So in this position, after the check, the king will be forced to go to e2. And now here you go on with the familiar queen f6. Now a move like e5 loses, because knight to d4 check, and whenever we get taken back, we've got this check winning the rook. So that's just a tactic that often occurs in such positions. So let's take this from the start and let's see something else. So c4, knight c6, knight c3, knight f6. So we got the 4 knights, the bishop, and after e3, this is what we're looking at now. We go on with e5 as mentioned in some of the previous videos. Okay, let's look at a few options now. If white plays this move, bishop to e2, so basically not doing any swap, neither pawn takes in e5 nor pawn takes in d5. If white just goes on with development, here it's very simple. Just take the pawn in d4 and you should be able to isolate the pawn, or at least take the opponent good bishop. This is important. If you remember, if you get to swap this bishop, the light square bishop, for the opponent light square bishop, then that's what you want to do. So here you're going to isolate the opponent pawn. If white takes you with the pawn, just take the one in c4, and now the pawn in d4 is isolated. So make sure you refer to all the previous videos that we've seen on how to punish the isolated d pawn. Obviously, white loses any potential advantage that he might get. Here now, there's also more attack over this pawn in d4, and it's isolated. If white pushes the pawn with an attack on the knight, here take the knight first. And now, obviously, if your opponent takes the knight here in c6, then you could the bishop retreats and takes the pawn. So basically, like this: if he takes, then take the queen, take back, and now simply recapture this pawn. And the good thing is that now you're up a pawn. You got a majority. You're up 2 pawns for no good reason. And in this position, yes, we just mentioned that if the knight is taken, you take the queen first, and then what if the bishop stays in this square to keep attacking the square in c4, and please try to recapture some material, and white rather recaptures with the knight? Well, now you play bishop b4, and when the king moves, you can swap with check, and now the king will move, unless our opponent maybe plays, okay, if bishop d2, take it, check, king takes, and you're winning material, because now castle, check, and when the king moves away, you're winning this bishop. Whereas if the king goes to e1, where he will still defend the bishop, then you just take in c6, and now the bishop going to capture in c4 is a suicide, because now you can bring all the pieces into check, king moves, knight to e4, threatening knight e2, But either way, we're also going to d2 with the rook in case, and we got an attack on f2. We got pressure on f2, but we're not going to be able to take it. But not soon, not now, but it's a completely winning position. Position evaluated -6. And in this position, after the check, instead of bishop d2, what about knight to c3? Well, okay, now we just recapture the pawn in c6, and we retain the material advantage, and also the pawn in c4 is actually safe because it cannot be taken. I mean, you can say in this case maybe it can be taken because we don't have castling with check available, but now you will also take the pawn in g2, which looks a bit crazy considering that our opponent can play rook g1, I mean has to play rook g1 to attack the bishop, and now might reach the 7th rank, but now you will play bishop to d5. The knight is pinned, remember. And now we're threatening to just win a piece, so our opponent will have to do something about it. If he moves away, you can castle safely. If not, if you get taken, knight takes back, you put in pressure on that knight, double attack on it, so bishop to d2 to defend it more. And after taking, the bishop takes, you can swap everything. You got 2 more pawns and a much better pawn structure. If instead they take you with the pawn, well, just go back to f8, saving the pawn in g7, and you're easily winning this endgame. So let's take it from the start. And we're looking at the 4 knights variation with e3, e5 as we know, bishop e2. Okay, take. And when they take you back, you can take in c4. What about when they push, as we are just mentioning, as we said, we take the knight. What if they take back with the bishop? Not reducing the initiative. The thing is, now you play knight e5, and after the bishop goes back to e2, putting pressure once again on the pawn in c4, then just bishop to d6. The pawn in c4 is defended. So castling by white, castling by black, and now the pawn in c4 is actually safe because f4 seems to be kicking the knight away. But the problem with this move is that you can play bishop c5, and now the pawn in c4 is still safe. We can retain our advantage. White moves the king, and I play knight to d3, preventing the bishop from capturing that pawn. Although you might say, okay, bishop takes, pawn takes, queen takes, and now the white player has recaptured the material. Yeah, okay, that's fine. However, rook to e8, position is better for black. Rook e8 is a great move because it stops rook e1, it stops bishop e3 from happening and trading with our strong bishop, and so that means white can't really develop. So for example, bishop to d2 seems to be able to connect the rooks and play completely normal moves. Bishop e3 is not accessible, as you notice, but then you play c6, the pawn is pinned and you should be able to win material. What if instead of bishop e2, white plays knight to a4, attacking our strong bishop? Okay, bishop to b6, believe it or not, is the best move. When we get taken, we take back with the a pawn, we've got a rook on an open file, and the control of the square d5 is lost forever. We're going to recapture there. So once again, from the start, 4 knights and the bishop, e3, e5, bishop e2 variation. We take. What if they take with the knight? Okay, fine, we trade this bishop. Queen takes back, and now queen to d7 is important. See, now it looks like there's a lot of attack over d5. If the knight is taken in c6, take back the queen to keep the pawn structure safe, and then the pawn is taken, and then the knight takes back. This is a very boring variation, but after bishop to d2, obviously, because if you take the knight, then you break the pawn structure, you got double attack on it. Castle long, and when white castles, queen to e6 is the best move. The idea is to play knight to f4, the pawn can't take, it's pinned. Or, I mean, yeah, the pawn can take, then you take the queen, queen takes back, and then the rook is going to the 2nd rank. So after the queen, see, something like this, right? So you take, and then this is better for black, obviously. So here the queen goes to e1, for example, but now you play knight to d3, and you're attacking the pawn in d2, and the queen. So when the queen goes to b1 to defend it, play queen to b6 and finalize the pressure on that square. If b3 to stop that, okay, bishop to a3. The idea of going to b2 and trap the rook, this is so insane. And even then, if bishop goes to c1, obviously you got double attack on it, you just take it and then you win the exchange. And a couple of moves ago, instead of b3, what about knight to d1 to protect the pawn in b2 a little bit further? Well, now you lose control of the bishop because you can take here, and after all the trades, you can take in d2. So back a few moves ago, after queen to d7, let's not look at the variation where they swap everything because it's boring. I mean, I've mentioned what the plan is, but it's kind of equal, slightly better for black variation. Let's look at other plans. Let's say castle. Okay, if that happens, and you can take the pawn in c4, and when the queen takes, then you can take. Pawn takes, and you've isolated the pawn. Obviously, queen takes is silly because then you take, of course, and you isolate the pawn and you play against the isolated pawn. It's easy to win that pawn. Bishop to e7 now. Rook to e1. Castle. Let's look at this idea. Knight to b5. Puts more attack over c7 and a7. What to do? Just attack the knight. As a matter of fact, this knight should not be going to c7 now, because you will simply pin it with the rooks. Rook a to c8, that's it. You're winning a piece. If bishop to f4 seems to be defending the knight, bishop to d8 will do the job. And even then, even if white had played rook takes here, sacrificing the exchange, queen takes back, and now bishop f4 to protect that more, you will play rook f to d8 and play rook to d7. And the knight has no escape. Neither b5 nor d5 will work. So in this position, after a6, the knight is forced to go to c3, b5, queen b3, rook f to e8 now, continuous development, d5 by white. How do we deal with this? Queen to f5. We're going to keep putting pressure on the pawn in d5 and attack it more with the knight, with the rook as well, until we can take it. These are all best moves by white according to the engine. Bishop to d6. And now we're threatening the rook. This light square bishop has got nowhere safe to go. Development of the bishop runs into knight g4. That's going to happen anyway. So if rook takes, for example, bishop e3, whatever. You play knight to g4, you're attacking the bishop. You're also attacking the square h2. So let's close the line there. Once again, from the start, let's look at some captures when after the 4 knights, right? So e3, e5. Here, instead of bishop e2, let's look at the captures, like pawn taking in the center. So let's look at this. We've never seen anything like this before. Pawn taking in e5. Okay, now here we take back with the knight. The knight in f3 is obviously pinned. Here 2 options, one of them being bishop e2 coming now to defend the knight further. That makes perfect sense. Or pawn taking in d5, which by the way seems to be a free pawn. Let's start with our opponent taking the pawn in d5, right? This is not a free, I mean, it is a free pawn at the moment, but we gotta play c6, and our opponent loses the center. This now cannot be retained. Let's make an example. Queen to a4 seems to be pinning the pawn in c6, right? But now you will take the knight, pawn takes back, and now bishop takes the pawn, and it's putting more attack over the pawn in d5. Rook to g1 has to be saved from the attack of the bishop, and now you recapture the pawn in d5. This is a much better endgame for black, obviously. Our opponent doesn't have the center, neither has a good development. And the funny thing is, he can't really castle because this bishop is a monster on this diagonal. So he will have to maybe trade bishop like this from g2. And now we play knight takes in c3, pawn takes back. We don't have a checkmate in d1, by the way, if that's what you're looking at, because of the opponent queen. But we will play queen g5, finalizing the attack over that bishop. This leaves white with the only option of playing king to f1, because the bishop is pinned, we were going to take it. So king f1 now puts enough defense over that square. Now you play bishop to g2, rook takes back, and now queen to d5, getting out of every trouble. And now a move like queen to d4 is met by simply long castling. Don't trade queens, of course. Long castle, you're doing just fine. And obviously our opponent can't, the queen, after castling, the queen cannot take the pawn in e7 because we got checkmate in d1. So that will be, that is a better, this position evaluated -2, it's a better endgame. Our opponent is just down a clean pawn. And this rook is not really a threat to the pawn in g7 because you can just move it anytime. So instead of that move, let's see this one, bishop to a3. The idea is to put pressure on the bishop. So after take, this is the best move. Queen takes back. Now there's pressure on the square g7, and we can't really castle. So that means we're going to have to castle alongside. And in this case, it appears to be possible that the queen can take the pawn in a7, because we don't have a checkmate in d1 anymore because of the protection of the rook. So what to do now? Now you will just play queen to d3. And when the king moves, this is a smothered king. This rook is like a pawn in the back rank. And now queen to d1 is checkmate soon. So the king will have to move. But when that happens, you can take in c3. And that's check, and you know what's going to happen next. So back in this position, we're playing, white is playing the 4 knights, we play e5. We're looking at the variation where they take in e5. Okay, take back. And now we're still looking at the variation where it looks like the pawn in d5 is free. Fine, you play c6. And earlier we went through queen a4. We noticed that it doesn't work. What about bishop e2? Defending the knight more. Fine, take it with the bishop. Pawn takes back. And now recapture the pawn in d5. That's it. f4, kicking the knight away. Knight simply back to c6. Bishop to f3. Finalizing the attack on the square d5. It looks like this pawn is now lost, but now you pin the knight. Okay, bishop to d2. I'm pinning it. Castle. a3 attacking the bishop. Bishop a5. Castle by white. Okay, d4. This is crucial. Obviously, this cannot be taken because then the pawn structure of our opponent is absolutely horrible. So after knight to e4, take the knight. Bishop takes back. Take the bishop. Queen takes back. Take the pawn. The queen cannot take back. The pawns will look horrible if the queen takes back. And the pawn can't take back because the queen is under attack. So queen has to swap with our queen. Now the best way to take is with the knight in order to save the pawn in b7. Now the pawn can finally recapture in e3. That's true. Rook to e3, rook to e8 though will put a skewer here, and the bishop will have to move, and you're going to be able to take that pawn. Bishop to d5. Rook takes here. Rook f to e1. Here you have to take it, unless you want to be checkmated. So rook takes, rook takes. King f8 is the key move. You don't want to give the possibility to your opponent to swap the bishop for the knight, isolate the pawn, and get passive. King f2. How do we finalize it? We up a pawn, right? It's a winning endgame. Now you play rook to c8. And yeah, this is how we're going to end this line. Black is winning. So in this position, once again, we're looking at the variation with e5, pawn taking in e5, and the knight taking back. And now the white play continues with pawn takes in d5, c6 as we mentioned. Now we tried queen a4, we tried bishop e2, none of that works. What if e4 to protect the pawn a little bit more? Okay, pin the knight, and now we're putting pressure on the pawn in e4. We're trying to win material. So after queen to b3, attacking the bishop and defending the knight, that could be an idea. Now first you take the knight in f3, pawn takes back, which is a bit crazy because that means that this pawn now in e4 isn't going to be taken, because obviously now you can play knight f3 check, and when the king moves, king to e1, remember not king to e2 because knight d4 wins the game. King to d1 is the only move, but now I play queen to e7, putting more attack over e4. Bishop d3 defends it. Also queen e7 is defending the bishop. That's very important. Castle. Bishop d2 develops, protects the knight a little bit further. Like, you're just taking d5 now. We'll close the line here. This is a horrible position for our opponent, because after all these swaps, you're just winning even more material. And back in this position, straight after taking the knight in f3, what if white doesn't recapture, allowing us to play knight f3 check with the devastating attack, and white just takes the bishop in b4 with the queen? That seems to be making sense. Now we make a desperado move. Take the pawn in g2 with an attack on the rook, so the bishop will take back, and now we will play knight d3 and win the queen, and white will resign, hopefully. No, I'm kidding. So let's go back and move. Obviously this move, this bishop in g2 cannot be taken because of knight d3, winning move. So rook to g1, okay, knight to f3. Do you see? King d1. But now, crazy enough, we don't take the rook, because when you take the rook and the bishop takes back, the knight is trapped. So the knight will have no escape. So the best move is to take the bishop. Rook takes back, queen to d7, protecting the pawn in b7. Okay, development. Bishop e3. a5 by black, attacking the queen. The queen will have to move. Well, if the queen goes to c5, for example, or if the queen goes to b3, for example, you just finally castle. And this is a winning endgame for black, as you notice. We should be able to win a pawn. We've got a safer king and the rooks are ready to play. So what if our opponent instead plays queen to c5? Still stopping us from castling. Okay, rook to d8, finalizing the pressure over this pawn. Okay, king to e2, unpinning so that our opponent can take. This loses immediately to queen to g4. So bear in mind that these tactics here will occur all the time. So back in this position, after playing e5, we're looking at the variation where d takes in e5. We take back, and now the one where, as I said already 1,000 times, the pawn in d5 appears to be free, and technically is free for the moment, but we play c6. Now, we've tried a little bit of everything in this position. The only thing we haven't tried is white retaining material advantage by taking in c6. Although that's obviously not good, because now you can play knight takes in f3 check, pawn takes back, queen takes queen, and now king takes queen is really stupid because bishop f3 will be making a fork and win the rook. So after knight takes back, only way, okay, take the pawn, and now the rook has to move to c1 to safety. But now you can simply recapture in c6. And yes, this is our opponent. This proves that our opponent cannot really retain the material advantage. That's just not going to happen. Okay, well, now this is kind of equal, so obviously knight c3, you're going to play the usual moves here. You're just going to develop. A move like bishop to d2 is immediately met with knight e4. And after the knight develops to c3, take the bishop. King takes back, long castle. You play this endgame with the bishop pair. That's the advantage that you're getting. And back in this position, instead of bishop d2 that we just saw, what about knight to c3 instead? More normal looking move. Fine, g6, and we're going to play it from the fianchetto. Bishop d2, now the idea of castling appears to be possible because knight e4 will be taken. But now bishop to d6, threatening to win a pawn. So that means white can't castle yet. h3, bishop to h2. The rook is trapped except one square, which is g5. And now castle appears to be possible. And yes, this is white having played only computer moves all the way until here. So you don't have to worry about this is not going to happen. You're going to win the game long before that. You know all the plans now. But even then, position is still better for black apparently. Rook a to c8, put the rook on the same file with the opponent king. Well, position is only evaluated minus 150 or something like that. It's just the development of the black player is a little bit more smooth. But the king now goes to b1, is met with knight e4. Winning the game immediately because you're attacking the rook. So after the knight takes you take back with check, and then you can infiltrate in the second rank and then double up the rooks. That's just an example of something that can happen, but we're going to leave it there. The point was to prove that white does not win the pawn in d5 for free. So here in this position, we're looking at the variation where the pawn just took in c6, retaining the material advantage. Let's see once again this variation, right? The pawn just took in c6, check, pawn takes back, swap queens, knight has to take, bishop takes. What if the white player doesn't play rook g1, but rather takes the pawn in b7? Okay, check. The knight will have to block. Obviously, the bishop cannot block because take, and now we save the rook from the attack of the pawn with check, rook d8. Whatever the white player wants to do doesn't matter. We're going to take the rook for free in h1. Which leads us back to this position, bishop check. What if knight blocks? The more sensible way to block. Okay, rook to d8 comes now, and we're threatening mate. There is no way around this. If white just plays bishop e5 check, king e7, we're completely safe. Rook d1 is still a threat. Bishop d2 stops that from happening, but then you win this rook. Okay, that means a couple of moves ago, instead of bishop developing, because what else is there to do? Okay, you might say bishop e2. No, because the rook. Stop forgetting about the rook in h1. So white might make a queen here, might make a promotion. Fine, just obviously now you have to take the queen. So white might now have time enough to save the rook. Rook to g1, and now, because we don't have the threat of rook going to d1 anymore, so knight e4 comes, and we're putting more attack over this knight. So if bishop defends, you know how to take it from here. You just got to take the bishop and conclude the game with the bishop pair. Again, this is some sort of transposition into something we've seen before. You can castle, and then the rooks will attack the opponent king, and you got better development. You're playing with the bishop pair, so this is the advantage you're getting. Which leads us to the last recap of all. Knight c3, knight f6, knight f3, bishop g4, e3, e5. Right, one last thing we need to see. In the variation where they take in e5, knight takes back. What happens if our opponent does not take the apparently free pawn in d5, but rather plays bishop e2 now? Okay, take it with the bishop. And now, if pawn takes, remember you got double attack on this pawn. On c4, you can just take it for free. So our opponent, the bishop, will have to. So our opponent will have to take the bishop with the bishop, because that will allow at least an attack on b7. So pawn takes in c4. Crazy or not, this is the best move. Queen takes, king takes is the best. This is the best move. Bishop takes b7, rook b8, bishop back to f3, bishop to b4. And after castling and pinning the knight, best move is king to c8. That's how we castle. The king is completely safe behind this pawn. There are no queens on the board, so the king is completely safe. And the rook is connected. I mean, it's not connected to the other rook, but it can come to play anytime. Two options we're going to look at, and we're going to close this video. Bishop to e2 now, to protect the to put pressure on that pawn. Maybe allow f4 with the idea of taking that pawn. But here he will just take this knight. Pawn takes back. Knight to e4, and now we're threatening this pawn. We should be able to take it. Bishop b2 is not possible. Bishop d2 is not possible. The knight in e4 is super strong. f4 kicking the knight away. But now you'll just take in c3. This is the best move because he comes with an attack on this bishop. You're going to be able to trade that bishop and then sit in d3 gloriously. And in this position, instead of bishop e2, what if a3, just attacking our bishop? Take the bishop. We check. So if the bishop doesn't save itself by going away, you take it. Check. So pawn takes back. And now you also take this one, because when they take you back, the knight to d5 puts pressure on c3. Bishop d2 is the only way to defend it. Rook to b2 comes now. Rook f to d1, protecting the bishop. Rook to d8. e4 attacks the knight. Knight to b6. You have to save the knight. But now there's a lot of pressure over the bishop. Bishop to e1, saving. But now you can take this one. Take back. And rook to a2 capitalizes on that pawn. Oh, let's do one last recap. We're looking at the four knights. Bishop g4, e3. There's one line that I forgot to show in one of the previous videos. Let's go once again through something we've seen in the past, which is pawn takes in d5 right now. Okay, we know we have to take back. And now, this move we haven't seen ever, which is bishop to c4 now, putting double attack on the knight. Okay, we attack the bishop, and the bishop will have to move. If the bishop goes back to e2, for instance, you take this pawn, and you know how to take it. Knight takes back, take the bishop, the light square bishop at least, queen takes back, and now take this knight, pawn takes back, it's check, but that's okay, you block it, and you've isolated the pawn of your opponent. Trading is now not good for white, because then we're gonna fight against the isolated pawn easier. So after bishop e3 developing, long castle, knight d5, threatens to damage the pawn structure. So after rook a to c1, take this bishop. Pawn takes back, we've reconnected the pawns, crazy enough, but now you play rook to d7. So after rook to f3, developing the rook, preparing to open, to play down the open file and protecting the pawn, e4 couldn't be pushed, right? g6, rook c to f1, bishop to h6. And now we don't really see, that's why we play the rook to d7, because the rook shouldn't go to f7. Now it looks like that's possible, but now we're applying enough pressure over e3 to finally take it. This is now unstoppable. Queen to f2, finalizing the attack over that square, but it doesn't matter. You play f5. Now we don't have to worry about the rooks going there anymore. Rook to e1 seems to be putting enough defense over that square, but now bishop to g7. The idea is to play rook to e8, and then bishop will be able to take in d4. None of this is stoppable. So in this position, after just playing the move knight to b6 to save it from the bishop, what if bishop to b3 instead of bishop e2? Fine, take the pawn once again. Okay, the knight is pinned, so pawn takes back, queen to f6, putting more pressure over f3. We're threatening to take, and isolate this pawn in f3, the 2 pawns on the f file, isolate them. This pawn is already isolated. So after queen e2 check, bishop e7, bishop e3, castle. Let's look at two options. If the bishop goes to d1 to save this the pawn structure here, because we're threatening to swap everything as soon as the knight is no longer pinned, fine, you take the pawn in d4. And that's free. Bishop takes, rook takes, that's fine. So in this position, instead of bishop to d1, what about d5 to save the pawn? Okay, fine, knight e5. The knight is still pinned. Bishop d1 now. What about that? Bishop b4. And finally, it looks like white might try to castle. But now you take the knight, pawn takes back. Take the knight, pawn takes back. Bishop h3. The rook is forced to move. But when that happens, you've got a checkmate coming. That means it's not going to happen. And you're winning the exchange.